Should we take notes?
Yeah, you should take notes, because the stuff that she's gonna cover here is stuff that we would have covered in class,
Yeah.
and I'm not gonna recover it.
Yes. Okay, so perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm going to talk to you guys today about long-term memory, the full rest of the chapters, encoding, retrieval, and consolidation. I'm basically just going to cover encoding and encoding strategies and how that helps retrieval. So hopefully the concept of attention isn't new to you. So hopefully everyone is at least partially attending to me right now, at least partially. But when you attend to something and then hopefully at another later time, probably closer to the exam, you're going to want to be able to retrieve what I'm telling you today so that you can study, right? Is this common practice? Everyone has that experience at some point? A couple head nods, good, okay. But in between these two steps, there's an important process that has to happen, okay? And this is the process of encoding. You have to be able to actually get that information that I'm telling you now into your long-term memory so that at a later point you can actually retrieve it. Okay, so today we're just going to talk about how to improve your memory with encoding, how encoding can actually help you if you use different strategies, different techniques to help you with retrieval later, okay? So your book, which I'm sure all of you have looked at very intensely, has this very lovely figure, which kind of sets up most of what I'm going to tell you today. So there are different factors to encoding, and I'm going to go through each one of these a little bit with you. So we'll start with creating connections and how this helps you later retrieve information. So there is a theory, it is levels of processing theory, and it goes over how to encode information and what is better for encoding, basically. So they have different types of rehearsal. So we have maintenance and elaborative rehearsal. Did anyone read ahead and wants to give a guess as to what these are? I expected as much, that is fine. So maintenance rehearsal is if I were to get a phone number from someone and they just spouted it off to me and I had to be able to keep that phone number in mind until I could write it down. So I'm just saying 785, whatever the rest of the numbers for Manhattan, Kansas would be. I know 785. If I just kept saying those over and over again so that I could remember it until I got to somewhere I could write it down, that is basically maintenance rehearsal, just repeating something a lot so that you can remember it basically more in the short term. You're not really creating connections or establishing that information into long-term memory, okay? But with elaborative rehearsal, you're actually taking information and you're creating connections with it and relationships, and you're understanding the meaning of whatever it is you're studying. So in this case, we're talking about going from attention to encoding to retrieval. So you would actually be taking what you know about attention, what you know about retrieval, and what you know about encoding, and connecting those ideas together so you can create one meaningful process to help you later remember it. Does that make sense? Again, one head nod, and that's from Cassie, so that's, okay. So which do we think will be better for memory in the long term? This, sorry? Elaborative, yeah, very good. Why would elaborative be better for you?
Because you're actually manipulating that information.
You're actually connecting that information, you're building relationships, connections, all of that to actually have this long-term sort of memory for it. Yeah, very good. So then we have different processing levels, which kind of go in line with the types of rehearsal. So we have deep and we have shallow. Just based off of the names alone, which do you think is going to be better for memory?
Deep.
Deep, yes, absolutely. So with the deep, it's sort of the same idea of elaborative rehearsal. You're actually taking the information and processing it at a deeper level, basically. I tried to find a way to not just use the word in my description, but it's very easy to think of it that way. But you're creating those connections, relationships, you're doing all of that with deep rehearsal, whereas shallow is if you're just highlighting stuff in a book, it's not really necessarily helping you remember that information. A lot of people think it's really good for you, but you're just highlighting stuff and it's not really, you're really doing anything with it, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, fantastic, okay. So we're gonna start talking about studies basically that show how these creating connections and building relationships is really good for later retrieval, okay? So in the first study, subjects could be in one of three conditions. So in the first condition, they were presented with a word like bird, and they had to say yes or no if the word was written in all caps or not, okay? In the next condition, they were given a word like train, and they had to say yes or no if it rhymed with another word like pain. And then in the third condition, they would see a word, car, and they had to say if that word would fit into a sentence. So if I say he saw a blank on the street, would car fit into that sentence? Yeah, yes it would. Perfect. Okay, so people did this, okay, depending on the category or the condition they were in. What do we think had the best memory? So if we think about maintenance versus elaborative, and hopefully understanding what that material means, which one of these categories do we think is producing the best memory for people? The third one, yeah, absolutely. So when we look at how much people were able to recall afterwards, when they encoded information and they actually took the word they were given and they were able to process the meaning and fit it into a sentence, they remembered it better than if they were just saying yes or no it rhymed or yes or no it was in all caps, okay? So this shows that retrieval, so when you're actually trying to remember those information, is impacted by how you encode that information. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes. Yes. You guys are nodding more. That is good. You're learning that I just want that approval. Perfect. Okay. So then in the next study, which is kind of an extension of the study we just talked about, they had the same three conditions. So all caps, if it rhymed, filling in the blank, or the meaning, but they also added a fourth condition, which is does this word relate to you? So they were using adjectives in this study, so like shy, happy, angry, etc. And they were asking people if it was written in all caps, if it rhymed with another word, if it fits into the sentence, and if it actually relates to you. Do we think that this fourth condition, if it relates to you, is going to help memory or hurt memory? Yeah, absolutely. It's going to help memory. So when we look at this, so we're looking at how much they actually remember. Okay, so we see the same trend for these same three categories we had in the last figure. But then when it relates to you, we see that memory is a lot better for those words that people are actually saying, like, yes, it does relate to me. Okay, so why does this happen? If you think about words, so if someone asks me if I'm shy or if I'm happy, then I have to think about the meaning of that word. And I have to think about how those words may relate to me. So I have to think of experiences that I've had or events, or maybe I've been shy or I've been happy. So I'm creating a lot of connections with these words, right? And I'm actually have to physically understand those words to be able to do this process. So it's an even deeper level of encoding than if I was just understanding that this is a car and it could be a word, okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So then the last study that we'll talk about in the creating connections sort of category here is the paired associates learning. So paired associates, they're going to be presented with two words, okay? And the example we're going to use here is boat and tree. So they're presented with two words, and in one condition, they just had to repeat the word for 5 seconds, just over and over again. Boat, tree, boat, tree, boat, tree, boat, tree, just over and over again. In the other condition, they were visually imagining these two words together, okay? And you'll see sort of what I mean when I show you the figure. They did this for 15 pairs total, though, and they tested the memory for those words afterwards, okay? So here, so this is boat, tree. I don't know how they, or if they were able to actually get people to imagine them like this or not, but this is sort of their depiction of imagining those having a relationship with each other, okay? So in the repetition group, they're not doing too hot, right? But almost more than double they are doing in the imagery group. So creating that image of the relationship of those two objects is helping memory a lot. So being able to picture how they may react, how they may be actually interacting with one another is helping with their later memory and retrieval. So how do these two groups, this repetition group and this imagery group, map onto the different types of rehearsal that I mentioned in the beginning? Yeah?
Repetition would be like maintenance, and then the imagery group would be like elaborative.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this repetition group is more of like the maintenance rehearsal, right? They're just repeating it over and over again to try to keep it in their memory as long as they can. But the imagery group are actually creating those connections, so it's more like elaborative rehearsal, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm gonna ask you guys if it makes sense probably 100 times, so just bear with me on that. But, okay, so we finished this first group then. This creating connections group. So we're going to move on to the generation group, which is a little bit shorter, but still interesting stuff. So in the generation group, the one study that the book talked about, they had a read group and they had a generation group. So in the read group, people were just reading these sort of paired words, so king, crown, horse, saddle, lampshade, etc., etc. And then in the generation group, they were giving them these same words, so they would still see king, but then they wouldn't finish the second word that they were presented with, okay? So they would still have to, they'd have to generate what that word would be. So they'd have to come up with the word crown afterwards, okay? So they were filling in those blanks, generating that word. Do we think that the generation group is gonna do better, or the generation group is gonna do worse? Bursting with enthusiasm.
It's called the generation effect, and we're talking about benefits to memory.
Probably better.
Probably better, yeah, absolutely, perfect. So on average, they remembered 28% more words compared to the regular reading group, okay? So when could you guys be using this generation effect, right? So obviously you're not just trying to remember like random pairs of words throughout your daily life. That's not a thing that you do probably. I don't anyway. But when could you actually be using something like the generation effect in your daily life? I don't know if this,
When you're studying for tests, like, you need to have some sort of memory method that helps you remember things.
yeah, so you could do something when you're studying for tests. So I thought like flashcards are almost going to be like that generation effect. So if you put like generation effect on the front of the card, then you have to actively generate what that definition is, or what the results were, or what the common findings are, without knowing, right? So you have that sort of cue, but you're still generating the rest of that information. Does that make sense? Okay. Do we have other moments where this is happening that we can think of, or just stick with the one? Yeah.
If there's like an acronym or multiple acronyms for something that you're learning, like PEMDAS, you have to fill in the
Okay,
rest of the
yeah,
word with the acronym.
absolutely, yeah, PEMDAS, oh yeah. That's math, right, PEMDAS? Okay, just making sure, oh my gosh, okay. So perfect, yeah, so this generation effect is something that happens in your daily life, typically. Okay, so then the last thing I want to talk about are organization effects. So, the last category. So, the first thing that the book talks about are different types of retrieval cues, right? So do we know what a retrieval cue is? No, okay. Matt says you probably shouldn't know what a retrieval cue is potentially. He hasn't taught it at least. So, okay. So if I give you this list of words, okay, so if I just like spout these off to you, and then I take them away and you have to recall them, okay? What could you potentially do with this list of words to help you recall them later? Just looking at them.
Imagine them all in a house together.
Imagine them in a house. Okay, that is very inventive. I didn't expect that from a 9:30 class. Perfect. So you can imagine them in a house together. So maybe a little bit more simply. So how do these sort of words relate?
You can chunk them into like house, like items, and then like fruits.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got these sort of groups. So we've got some fruits. This is some amazing PowerPoint skills. Disappear and appear. I work in the law on that, guys. And then we've got furniture, and we've got clothes. So you could, as you're reading, or not reading this, but as you're seeing it, you could potentially be grouping these together so that you have these smaller subsets, right? So you have fruits that were presented, you have clothes, you have furniture, you have all these subsets of items, and that may help you later to retrieve these items, okay? The idea of like a retrieval cue makes sense, sort of grouping things into a smaller category to help you later. Okay, perfect. I'm getting a ton from you guys right now, so this is good. Okay, so in line with this, they presented people with these trees in one of the studies, okay? So they either gave people this information so that it was very structured and very organized, okay? So at the top, just minerals in general, and then metals and stones. So they're presenting them almost with this structure so that they have these retrieval cues, right? So they've got metals, which are broken down in 3, and then more specifics under each of those, okay? But the purpose of the study, though, was to see if when they have the tree versus when they don't, what their memory looks like. So they did this with 4 separate trees. So they had minerals, and then they had trees was another one. blanking on the other two, but they had 4 different types of these organizational trees happening. So when they did this, they found that when you were presented with this organization, you remembered 73 words, versus when they just gave you the words in an unorganized manner, you only remembered about 21, okay? So what does that suggest for memory? If my question is vague and weird, you can tell me that, that's fine.
They should be used to vague and weird questions, actually.
Yes?
That when we split information up into categories, we remember it better?
Yeah, when you have these sort of smaller groups of information and you're splitting them up a little bit, it may help with your memory in the long term so that you have some sort of organization happening within your memory that makes it easier to retrieve. Okay? Okay. So then the last one, this is a lot, so I'm gonna urge you to not read this, okay? So don't read it. I'll go over the highlights. So if you are arranging things into different groups and maybe one pile's enough, maybe you need more, you could have a lack of facilities. It's better to do too few things than too many things. A mistake can be expensive, but it's just something you have to do. You may arrange things into groups again after you're done to put them in different places, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated, but that's just a part of life. So I'm gonna take this away so that you engage with me instead of trying to read that super long paragraph. Do you guys have any idea what I was talking about when I was telling you all of that just then? And it's okay to say no, because you're really not supposed to understand what I was talking about. So if none of that makes sense, that's fine. Because if I give you this picture though, do things make a little bit more sense? Arrange things into piles, mistakes can be expensive, better to do too few than too many. Maybe not the piles thing, because the piles thing, I don't know if you have to be an adult to do that, but everything goes into one load for me, so. But does it make more sense if I tell you this is about washing clothes? Yeah, it should, hopefully, unless you don't wash clothes, then I'm so happy for you, it's not a fun thing to do. But they presented people with these very long, very vague sorts of paragraphs, and they found that when they didn't have the picture, their memory was pretty bad for what they had just been presented with, okay? And when they had the picture reference, their memory was a lot better. They actually remembered twice as much information from that paragraph as people who didn't have that information or didn't have the picture associated with it. So the picture provides a mental framework, okay? So we're latching on this idea that having an image or even a title could help to help you organize that information in your mind. So, and then to also help you make those relationships between the sentences. So right now, the sentences just are kind of scattered and they don't really mean a lot by themselves, but when you have that picture, it makes a lot more sense. Okay? Does that make sense? And having that picture to relate all of these pretty meaningless ideas helps you a lot with remembering things later. Yeah. There's another fun example in your book. I took the picture off of here because it was really hard for me to explain, but it's just a really tall building and a string and like a boombox thing. I encourage you to go look at it. It was very strange, but they had multiple different examples of these that they did.